Welcome back, everyone, to the Lake Eufaula length limit example, part two, the rest of the story. Just to give a quick overview of what we covered in the first video, Lake Eufaula or Walter F. George, depending on which side of the border you live on, is a large reservoir on the Chattahoochee River between Alabama and Georgia. It's a long history of largemouth bass fishing and bass tournaments going all the way back to the early years of Bass Angler Sportsman Society. It has a major boat ramp and facilities to host large tournaments at Lake Point State Park, which is just north of Eufaula, Alabama, the county seat of Barber County. Relatively small town, but sitting on an economic gold mine right there with Lake Eufaula. So the background. There was no minimum length limit on this reservoir prior to 1992. Fast growth and high harvest led to biologists to put a 16-inch minimum length limit on that reservoir in 1992. The modeling showed that that would definitely increase harvestable size fish. However, in 1997, largemouth bass virus hit that reservoir really hard and eliminated a lot of the big fish in there. And tournaments noted that there was a large decline in legal fish, making it hard for them to actually host events that were attractive to anglers. So biologists collected data. Their findings were that there was a big drop in harvest. Harvest went from about 30% in the 80s to 10% by the mid 90s. There was slower growth of largemouth bass, probably due to lingering effects of largemouth bass virus, although the slower growth that continues today. There was no change in total annual mortality, even though there was a big drop in harvest, so that means that natural mortality increased pretty substantially. So there were starting to be questions about whether that 16-inch minimum really is needed. Looking at tournament data and how many tournament anglers were fishing the lake, there was a pretty clear drop-off once the LMBV hit. And that led a lot of tournament anglers and residents of that lived on the lake, especially for folks in Eufaula, Alabama, which derived a fair amount of income from the anglers that come to fish this lake, especially in tournaments. So there was a lot of concern about that. And so the question is if we want the big tournaments to continue to come here, something has to be done. And the question was raised, what if the limit was lowered to 14-inch minimum? Would that be enough? Would that do something? So how do you find that out? Well, you do population dynamics modeling. And so I'm not going to go through all that. I mean, exactly, you kind of saw the idea of the trade-off between natural mortality and growth rate in the previous video. I'm just going to use some real data here to show you what the models were telling us. So this is fish entering the fishery if you had a 12-inch minimum. This is fish entering the fishery if you had a 14-inch minimum. And this is fish entering the fishery at the current, or what was the current, 16-inch minimum length limit. And that's natural mortality increasing. And naturally, as natural mortality increases, the number of fish reaching that length limit, whether it's a self-imposed one or a legal one, will decline, right? And so how well would the 14-inch minimum make things for these tournament anglers? So back in the old days, we were operating here with a 15% natural mortality rate. But now we're here, 25% natural mortality, perhaps as high as 30. So we have to keep that in mind. So if we were back in the old days, if we just took that 16-inch minimum off and went to no minimum or a 12-inch minimum, which is essentially the same thing, you would have about 1.5 times as many fish available for tournament anglers to weigh in. If we went to a 14-inch minimum, you would still get about 1.2 times as many fish available at that minimum, at that level of natural mortality rate. But if we're over here, if you take the 16-inch minimum off, you get an even bigger jump. And if you go to a 14-inch minimum, it's not as much of a jump, but it's still quite substantial. You're saying to the tournament folks that there's probably 1.6 times as many legal size bass out there for you to weigh in a tournament under a 14-inch minimum than the current 16-inch minimum.
That was starting to look really good, a really good option to the fisheries biologists at the time. Anglers were interested in the slot. They always are. Slot limits are sort of like crack cocaine to a lot of anglers. They think that they do things that they don't. They're always interested in them. And there's a wide variety of reasons why they don't work, but you could lump most of them under no one will harvest fish under the slot. You saw what the harvest rate was on that reservoir, 5%, 10%. Would we ever be able to get 30% of the fish caught under the slot limit to be harvested in today's climate? It seems unlikely. And if you don't have the fish harvested under the slot, then the slot isn't a slot. It's just a minimum length limit at the upper end of the slot. And also for tournament angling, they don't usually allow people to weigh in fish under the slot. What they most normally do, they use the upper end of the slot. Fish have to be over the slot to be weighed in. But let's just say that a miracle occurs and we were able to convince anglers to harvest enough bass underneath the slot that you would increase growth rates. Would that actually make any difference? So we have two levels of natural mortality here, 20% and 30%. We have high or low harvest. In other words, is it staying the same or could we get them to harvest the fish under the slot? If they harvest fish under the slot and it increases growth, this is the best case scenario. How would the slot limit perform? And how would it perform compared to what was then still the current limit of 16-inch minimum? So these numbers here tell a story. First of all, under the 20% natural mortality rate, whether harvest was low or high and growth was slow or fast, you essentially still had about 30% of your fish reaching 16 inches. So that's still a pretty crappy number. If you go down and look at what was going on under the 16-inch minimum length limit under low harvest and slow growth, it looks really much the same. You'd never notice the difference between that. And the same was true at under 30% natural mortality. There's no difference between whether you could or couldn't get people to harvest fish under the slot and you did increase growth rates. It really didn't matter. And neither of those really did anything different than what the 16-inch minimum length limit was doing under the current scenario of low harvest and slow growth. And so there really was no real reason to go with a slot limit. It would just be unnecessarily complicated. And the reason for that was really because of the high natural mortality rate. It was taking out the fish before they reached the end of the slot limit. And so it really didn't matter whether or not you had high harvest or low harvest or slower growth or faster growth. It wasn't enough to overcome that higher natural mortality rate. So the conclusions. So if you have decreased tournament participation and you have a decreased angler success rate and you have a ridiculous time now to catch bass over 5 pounds, if growth is slow, and if you have very few large fish anyway because of LMBV and the lingering effects, and no one's harvesting fish anymore, then why have a high minimum length limit? And this is the question that the biologists were all asking themselves in the late 1990s. And so the benefits of reducing that length limit, hopefully you're going to get increased tournament participation. You're going to get happier anglers. You're going to have a happier chamber of commerce. That slot limit wasn't going to be beneficial. The increased growth was offset by increased harvest and natural mortality rate. And so therefore, both Alabama and Georgia agreed to lower the minimum length limit on the largemouth bass to 14 inches starting at the 1st of November of 2000. And early response from that change was extremely positive, especially for the tournament anglers. And that is still the law of the land there today. And that is the reasoning why that limit got changed. And just to show you that modeling really does work, so this is the number of fish weighed in tournaments per angler day. Again, you saw these before, about 3 under the no minimum length limit, about 1 or less than 1 under the 16-inch minimum. And that has 90% increase to about 1.5 to 2 per day following the change to a 14-inch minimum length limit. Percent success, chance of someone weighing in 1 fish in a tournament, a lot higher with no minimum length limit and a self-enforced 12-inch minimum. 50% declining through time with the 16-inch minimum. But when they went to a 14-inch minimum, it actually looked a lot like what it looked like under the self-imposed 12-inch minimum in the good old days. And I didn't mention this before, but why is success rate and why is the number of fish weighed in? Why do we care? So, the tournaments are still won by the best of 5, right? Well, you have to also think about the way tournament organizations are run, about the way tournament seasons are run, and how some of the annual awards are run. A lot of them are based on point systems that are based on fish you weigh in, whether you win the tournament or not. And so if you can't even weigh in fish, you don't want to go here. Yeah, you can still win money if you weigh in 3 big fish and half the field doesn't weigh in anything, you still get paid. But it's just not attractive to everybody. And this was why there was so much of angst about what was going on in Lake Eufaula in the late 1990s. And so the tournament angling have come back. Eufaula has held major fish tournaments on that reservoir every year. National fish tournaments has been there in the last 2 or 3 years. And the city of Eufaula is quite happy. I was involved in a study back in the late 2000 teens that showed that in just 1 year of fishing, a lot of which was tournament fishing, the Lake Eufaula produced over $10 million in direct expenditures by anglers. And so if you're the town of Eufaula with 10 or 15, maybe 20,000 people living there, and you have sitting in your backyard an economic engine that annually produces $10 to $12 million a year in direct expenditures by the folks showing up, you're very interested in how the fishing is over there. It's not just an academic question. It's not just something you ask people at the barber shop. You're asking, how is fishing? Are you going to come back? How many tournaments are we going to get next year? And so there's a reason why length limits are on lakes. Sometimes it's to protect the fishery, and sometimes it's just to enhance the fishery. And enhancing the fishery in this case means allowing people to weigh in fish in tournaments and come back and spend their money. So I certainly hope that this was informative and interesting to you. I think it's good to know as anglers and general public, the reasoning behind length limits. Your fish biologists are not just pulling numbers out of a hat or using the magic 8-ball. They collect data. They use computer modeling and population dynamics modeling to pick the best option with the goal that they have in mind. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a nice day.